The scent of lilies is supposed to be comforting, a floral veil over the sharp edge of grief, but today it felt like it was choking me. I sat in the front row of the empty chapel, the velvet pew cold beneath my palms, staring at the polished mahogany of my mother's casket. I had spent 42 years believing I knew every corner of Alina Vance's heart. I knew how she liked her tea, steeped for exactly 4 minutes, and I knew the specific, melodic hum she made when she was tending to her African violets. I was her only child, her shadow, her pride. Or so I thought until the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel creaked open, admitting a sliver of harsh afternoon light and a man I had never seen before in my life. He didn't walk like a mourner. There was no hesitation in his step, no bowed head. He moved with a calculated, predatory grace, flanked by a younger man in a sharp, slate blue suit carrying a leather briefcase. They didn't stop at the guest book. They didn't look at the flowers. They walked straight toward me, the echo of their heels on the marble floor sounding like a countdown. The man stopped a few feet away. He looked remarkably like my mother. The same high cheekbones, the same slight curve to the bridge of his nose. For a second, my breath caught in my throat. I felt a dizzying wave of vertigo, as if the floor had tilted. "Julian?" he asked. His voice was sandpaper on silk, familiar yet entirely alien. "I'm sorry," I managed to say, standing up and smoothing my black dress. "The service isn't until Thursday. We're still preparing." "I'm not here for the service," he said, and the corners of his mouth didn't quite lift into a smile, but his eyes hardened. He gestured to the man beside him. "This is Mr. Aris. I believe you've been living in my mother's house, which makes it, by blood and by law, my house as well." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was frayed at the edges, a black and white snapshot of my mother as a young woman, glowing and radiant, holding a swaddled infant in a garden I didn't recognize. "I'm David," he said, "your brother, and I've come to collect what she owed me." I looked from the photo to the casket, then back to the man who shared her face but none of her light. My world, the one built on 4 decades of certainties, began to fracture right there in the silence of the funeral parlor. Before we go any further, I want to thank you for joining me here today. It's a quiet afternoon in my corner of the world, and I find myself sitting by the window, watching the leaves drift down, thinking about how little we truly know about the people who raised us. I've always found comfort in sharing these stories with you. It makes the world feel a little smaller, a little more connected. If you're out there listening, perhaps over a cup of tea or while going about your day, I'd love to know where you're joining me from. It's a privilege to have your company as we sit with this story for a while. My mother, Elinor, was a woman of routine and quiet elegance. Our house, the one David was now claiming, was a sprawling Victorian on the edge of town, filled with the scent of dried lavender and old books. Growing up, it was just the two of us. My father had passed when I was barely 3, a shadow in a few silver framed photos, leaving Mom to raise me on a librarian's salary and a fierce sense of independence. I remember the rhythm of our lives so clearly. Every Saturday morning was dedicated to the inheritance, though back then, it wasn't about property. It was about the stories. She would take out the heavy family albums and trace the faces of ancestors I'd never met. "Character is the only thing they can't take from you, Julian," she'd tell me, her fingers lingering on a photo of her own mother. She was the pillar of our community. She volunteered at the hospice, she led the historical society, and she never missed a Sunday service. She was transparent, or so I believed. There were no locked drawers in our house. No hushed phone calls. No mysterious disappearances. When she passed away peacefully in her sleep at 72, my grief was pure, uncomplicated by resentment. I spent the first 48 hours after her death walking through the rooms of that house, touching the lace doilies she'd crocheted, smelling the faint, lingering trail of her Chanel no. 5. I felt like the sole keeper of a beautiful, finished book. I had already picked out her favorite dress for the viewing, the navy silk one she wore to my university graduation. I had coordinated with the florist for white roses and baby's breath. I was functioning on a sort of somber autopilot, honoring the woman who had been my entire world. I was her only daughter, her only heir, and her only legacy. That was the reality I lived in until David walked into that chapel. Now, as I stood looking at the photograph he held, a photo of a younger, vibrant Elinor holding a baby, the walls of my home and my life felt like they were made of thin glass. She never mentioned you, I whispered, my voice trembling, not once in 42 years. David tucked the photo back into his pocket. Guilt is a quiet roommate, Julian, she chose to forget. But the law has a much better memory than a mother's conscience. He handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a birth certificate. It looked authentic, the state seal, the hospital in the next county over, the date of birth exactly 1 year before mine. And there, in the neat, cursive script I had seen on 1,000 grocery lists and birthday cards, was her signature, Elinor Vance. The manila envelope felt like it weighed 100 pounds as I walked back to my car. David and his lawyer didn't stay for long. They left me with a courtesy copy of their filing and a deadline. They wanted an inventory of the estate by the end of the week. My mother wasn't even in the ground yet, and already they were measuring the square footage of her grief. When I got home, the house felt different. The familiar creak of the floorboards under my feet sounded like a question. I sat at the kitchen table, the birth certificate smoothed out before me. It looked perfect. The ink was faded in just the right way. The paper had that slightly brittle texture of documents from the early 70s. But as I sat there, the initial shock began to recede, replaced by the librarian's daughter in me, the girl who was taught to check the references. I began to go through her things, not with the tenderness of a mourning daughter, but with the cold precision of an investigator. I started with her desk. My mother was meticulous. Every utility bill from the last decade was filed chronologically. Every tax return was tucked into its own folder. I found a small, locked metal box at the back of her closet. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pried it open with a screwdriver, expecting to find letters to a hidden son or perhaps receipts for secret support payments. Instead, I found my own baby teeth, a lock of my hair from my first haircut, and my father's wedding ring. Then I saw it, a small black ledger. It wasn't a diary, it was a record of her health. My mother had been a diabetic since her early 20s, long before I was born. She had kept a daily log of her insulin and her symptoms. I flipped back, my fingers trembling, to the year David was supposedly born. According to the birth certificate, David was born on October 14th. I found the page for that month in her ledger. On October 14th, my mother had recorded a low blood sugar episode while working a double shift at the university library. There were notes about a book sale. There were notes about a dinner she'd cooked for my father. There was no mention of a hospital. There was no mention of a recovery. In fact, she had worked every single day that week. A woman doesn't give birth to an 8-pound baby and return to shelving books at the library the next morning. I looked at the birth certificate again. The signature. It looked like hers, the elegant E, the sharp V. But as I held it up to the light of the desk lamp, something caught my eye. The V in Vance had a tiny, almost microscopic hitch in the ink, a tremor that didn't match the steady hand of the woman who had written in the ledger that same day. I realized then that David hadn't come for a mother. He had come for a payday, and he had spent a long time perfecting the script. But he hadn't accounted for the fact that Eleanor Vance left behind more than just a house. She left behind a paper trail of a life lived with honesty. The next morning, I didn't go to the florist and I didn't go to the cemetery. Instead, I drove to the county record's office. My eyes were stinging from a lack of sleep, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I spent hours in a basement that smelled of damp paper and industrial cleaner, scrolling through microfilm. If David's birth certificate was real, there would be a corresponding entry in the hospital's registry and the county's ledger. I found the records for October 1971. I scanned the names Miller, O'Connell, Patterson. There was no David Vance. In fact, there was no male child born on October 14th that year at all. But there was an entry that made my blood run cold. On that exact date, a woman named Martha Jenkins had given birth to a son. Martha Jenkins had been my mother's roommate in college, a name I recognized from the old scrapbooks. I leaned back, the blue light of the microfilm reader making the world look ghostly. I remembered a story Mom had told me once about a dear friend who had gone away for a summer and returned changed. Martha had passed away 5 years ago, alone in a nursing home 3 states over. I realized then that David wasn't just a stranger. He was the son of my mother's best friend. He must have found the old photos and letters after his own mother died. He knew my mother was a woman of standing, a woman with a house that was paid for, and a reputation beyond reproach. He had taken his own birth certificate and, with a talent for forgery that was truly chilling, had layered my mother's name over his own mother's tragedy. But the betrayal cut deeper. As I dug further, I found a series of letters tucked into the back of a different file at the library, personal correspondence my mother had archived. Martha had written to my mother for years. In one letter, dated decades ago, Martha thanked my mother for the financial help and for keeping my secret when no one else would. My mother hadn't been a liar, she had been a protector. She had spent years sending money to Martha to help raise David. She had been his secret benefactor, his safety net. And how did he repay that decades long kindness? By waiting until she was silenced by death to try and strip her daughter of her home. He wasn't a brother. He was a parasite who had mistaken my mother's grace for weakness. I left the archives and went straight to the funeral home. I had a service to finish planning, but I also had a phone call to make to a private investigator I'd found in the yellow pages. I didn't just want to stop David. I wanted to see the look on his face when he realized that Eleanor Vance's daughter was every bit as meticulous as her mother. The investigator I hired, a retired detective named Miller, found the missing pieces of the puzzle in less than 48 hours. He didn't just find David's real birth certificate, he found David's history. It was a trail of burnt bridges, investment opportunities that went nowhere, and a string of elderly marks he had tried to charm out of their savings. He's a professional, Julian, Miller told me over a lukewarm cup of coffee in my kitchen. He waits for a death notice, looks for a family with a gap, an only child, a widowed parent, and he moves in. He's been practicing that signature for months, I'd bet on it. I didn't call the police, not yet. I wanted this to happen on my mother's terms. The day before the funeral, I invited David and his lawyer, Mr. Arris, to the house. I told them I was ready to discuss the transition of the property. They arrived looking triumphant. David was wearing a dark suit that looked too expensive for a man who claimed to be a struggling long lost son. He walked through the foyer, his eyes greedily tracing the crown molding and the antique grandfather clock. "It's a beautiful home, Julian," he said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "I'm glad Mom kept it in such good shape for us." "She did," I said, my voice steady. I led them into the dining room where I had laid out 3 items. The Black Health Ledger, the original microfilm scanned from the county archives, and a letter from the State Bar Association regarding Mr. Aris's past disciplinary actions. The lawyer's face went pale immediately. David, however, kept his mask on. "I don't see what these are for," David said, gesturing dismissively at the ledger. "This," I said, pointing to the ledger, "is my mother's medical record. It proves she was at work 6 towns away the day you claim she gave birth to you. And this," I slid the microfilm scan toward him, "is your real birth certificate. Your mother was Martha Jenkins. My mother sent her money for 20 years to keep you fed. She was the reason you had a roof over your head, David." I leaned in, the silence in the room heavy enough to crack. "You didn't come here for a mother. You came here because you thought a grieving woman would be an easy target, but you made one very big mistake." David sneered, the charm finally evaporating. "It's her signature on the filing, Julian. In court, it's my word against a dead woman's diary." "Actually," I replied, "it's your word against the DNA sample I've already authorized the funeral home to take. And since you're so certain of your lineage, I'm sure you won't mind providing a cheek swab to the officer waiting in the hallway." The color drained from his face. He looked at the door, then at the lawyer, who was already packing his briefcase and moving toward the exit. The officer wasn't actually standing in the hallway. Not yet. But the bluff worked better than any physical restraint. David's lawyer, a man who clearly valued his license more than David's dwindling prospects, didn't even say goodbye. He simply walked out of the house, leaving his client standing alone in a room full of shadows and proof. David's posture crumbled. The long lost son vanished, replaced by a man whose life was built on a foundation of sand. He didn't apologize, he didn't beg for forgiveness. He just looked at me with a cold, hollow resentment. "She had so much," he spat, gesturing to the silver tea service on the sideboard. "What was one house to her? My mother died with nothing, and your mother lived in a palace built on her secrets." "My mother lived in a house built on hard work and kindness," I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a shout. "She supported you. She supported your mother. Your mother didn't die with nothing. She died with a friend who never betrayed her. It's a shame you didn't inherit that." I gave him 10 minutes to leave. I watched from the front porch as he got into his car and drove away, the tires spitting gravel against the curb. The next day, the funeral was held. It was a small, dignified affair, exactly as she would have wanted. The pews were filled with people she had helped, neighbors whose kids she had tutored, librarians she had mentored, and friends who had known her for 50 years. David didn't show up. Neither did his lawyer. After the service, as the guests gathered at the house for tea and sandwiches, the local paper's obituary section ran a small correction I had submitted. It didn't mention the fraud. It simply reaffirmed the facts of her life, listing her only daughter and her years of service to the town. The community knew. They saw the police car that had eventually pulled into David's motel that evening to serve a restraining order and a notice of intent to file charges for fraud. In a town this size, silence speaks louder than a headline. People squeezed my hand a little tighter that day. They didn't ask questions, they just offered their strength, realizing that I had fought a silent battle to keep my mother's name as clean in death as it had been in life. It took months for the silence in the house to feel like peace instead of an absence. I spent many of those days going through the rest of the files, but I stopped looking for secrets. I started looking for the woman. I found more letters from Martha. In the later ones, Martha expressed her regret that David had turned out restless and bitter. My mother had underlined those words. Underneath, in the margin, she had written, "We can give them the map, but we cannot make them walk the path." I realized then that Mom knew exactly who David was. She had likely seen his resentment growing from a distance, which was why she had kept such meticulous records. She wasn't just organized, she was preparing me. She knew that one day her kindness might be used as a weapon against me, and she had left me the shield I needed. I decided to keep the house. For a while, I thought about selling it, but the memories here are too sturdy to be shaken by a man like David. I repainted the guest room, the one he had likely imagined himself occupying, and turned it into a sunroom for the African violets I inherited from her. I'm 70 now. My own hair is as silver as hers was. Sometimes, when the light hits the mahogany table just right, I see my reflection and I see her looking back at me. There is a quiet, imperfect peace in knowing that the truth survived. I didn't just save a piece of real estate, I saved the story of a woman who was better than the world gave her credit for. Grief is a heavy burden, but it's lighter when it's shared with the truth. I often wonder how many of us are living in the shadows of secrets we don't even know exist. My mother wasn't a saint, but she was a protector, and in the end, that was the greatest gift she could have left me. I want to thank you for sitting with me today, for listening to this chapter of my life. It means more than I can say to have you here in the quiet. Before I go, I have to ask, have you ever discovered something about a loved one that changed the way you saw them? And did it make you love them less? Or did it make you realize just how much they were carrying for you? Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.